There is often a distinction made between direct and indirect forms of colonial rule. Indirect rule essentially means ruling through intermediaries. The classical model of indirect rule had been introduced by the British in India, and now they brought it to Africa. Ernest Azike remembers the system of indirect rule where he grew up in eastern Nigeria.
The traditional rulers had a lot of role to play because they were working in conjunction with, call them the colonial masters representative. They were all working in concert with the dictates of the colonial administration, how to punish people, how to keep orderliness, and so on. So I would say that the traditional rulers were an eye to the colonial masters.
The historian Hakim Adi argues that often such a system was developed in order to make it appear that traditional political institutions were still in place.
And it might be argued that the British colonial rule, for example, hid behind what appeared to be traditional rulers. But the fact is that in most cases, these so-called traditional rulers were given powers or had authority that they did not exercise traditionally. And in some cases, what were referred to as traditional rulers were actually created where none existed.
Okay, the main purpose for a lot of the videos, especially when, Arab slave trade, is that we have to accept that brutality is a common theme throughout history. And if we're going to say that, slave trading in Africa was somehow different than cruelty that was going on all over the world, the rest of the world, the one thing that's important would be how it underdeveloped the continent, and the number that actually left the continent is much smaller than the amount that was killed, because when going to war for the sole purpose of getting slaves instead of taking prisoners, when you went to war for another reason but happened to take prisoners, that as opposed to seeing slavery as a horrible thing but better than dying, people would start to see slavery as being worse than death, so it's hard to get people out. So this made that hundreds of millions were destroyed, and that's why the destruction of Africa is something that started in the 16th century. The effects that the slave trade had on African societies are not evident before that point. The horrors of the Arab slave trade, it was always horrible, but it's epic after the 16th century. So if a country apologized for slavery, it would be for since the 16th century or later, whenever. People have to put things into comparison, like, for example, the Egyptians had good relations with Africans, but people have used things from Egyptian writing to say, oh, because such primitive, which is just really childish to think that. And urbanization of Africa is something from the colonial era. Arabs that settled on that coast and intermarried, their children were African. Neither in sub-Saharan Africa, there's little evidence that the people were forced, that Arabs or anyone else had any capacity to force them to do anything. That they adopted different things, including Islam, because they thought it was political reasons or whatever else for trade, or because they really believed it. And yeah, what's important about this article is it appears to me that some of the so-called Arabs that are black people, they're confused because they're being told this. This is something that was any part of Arab countries or African countries, that an Arab that goes to Africa and marries, there's no more Arabs after that because the children are African. An African that goes to an Arab country and marries becomes Arab. Their children are Arab. And colonialism and slave trade, massive slave trade, would it screw up the whole thing. So it's all lopsided. It's a point for people to be critical when they're researching this history.